Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. It's a real honor for me every year to introduce myself, and over the past number of years, I've introduced myself in a variety of ways. I am always Sarah King, but since we started this program, I have been a PhD student here at UNB, and I've worked in a couple of different staff roles, and I'm now the Director of Experiential Education. So the UNB community is very important to me, and it's really lovely to be able to share this ceremony with you. To give you a little bit of history, this is our 6th UNB Remembers ceremony. It seems amazing to believe I've been here that long. I attended the Greg Center's War in the Canadian Experience Teachers Tour in France and Flanders. You need a shorter name, Lee. In 2012, in the summer 2012. And while we were on that tour, one of our colleagues from Winnipeg had the group that was there do a seminar sort of discussion, and the question was, what does your school do for Remembrance Day? And so there were elementary school teachers and high school teachers, and there were a group of us from UNB, and when we sat down, we realized we don't do anything for Remembrance Day. And so myself and Kate Charette and Trip Lewis came back and said, okay, well, we better do something. And so we started, with the support of the Greg Center, the UNB Remembers ceremony in 2013. On that first occasion, we were small but mighty. There were maybe 25 or so of us. We all fit in the President's Room in Alumni Memorial. And so it's really gratifying to see how this has grown, and really, I'm really pleased to be able to share it with you. Last year we added the live stream, so thank you to UNB Media Services for arranging that every year, and for those of you who are watching in that way. The UNB Remembers ceremony is an opportunity for our UNB community to reflect on the continued impact of war on our communities, and to work together for a more peaceful country and a more peaceful world. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that all of UNB's student experience takes place on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoq people. The river that runs at the base of our campus is the Wolastoq River, also known as the St. John River, along which live the Wolastoqwig people of the beautiful and bountiful river. At this time, I'd like to invite Alex Landine, a two-time UNB alumnus and a current marketing officer with student recruitment, to come and lead us in O Canada. If you could please stand.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all our vast command, with loving hearts we see thee rise, the true North strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
And now, to provide greetings on behalf of the UNB administration, I'm going to call upon Bob Skillen, who's our Vice President of Advancement.
Thank you very much, Dr. King. That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Well deserved. So on behalf of the President, I welcome you to this morning's ceremony. It's fitting that we gather in this beautiful and sacred space. And because it is a day to remember, I would ask that each of you, in your own way, remember Diane Campbell and have close to your hearts Eddie, his children, his family, and the Brennan family today and over the next few days. We suffered a tremendous loss this week with our good friend Diane Campbell. So Remembrance Day has been an important day for the Skillen family for as long as I can remember, certainly from the very early days that our children were with us. And there wasn't a ceremony that we missed when they were with us. And as they've gone on to their own lives, Giselle and I continue to celebrate Remembrance Day every year. In addition to my experience close to home, I have had the good fortune to travel to the battlefields of Europe, both Giselle and me on our own, but also with the Gregg Center, and more importantly, to visit the cemeteries. And so without question, the act of remembrance has been an important part of my life, and it continues to be so. But after accepting Sarah's invitation this morning, I reflected a bit more on what Remembrance Day actually means to me. And what I decided that, for me, what Remembrance Day means, really means, it speaks to what it means for us to be human in this world. As a Canadian, it also speaks to me of the values that we cherish, such as various freedoms, social justice, human rights, human dignity. And in our society, we also cherish life. So for me, the act of remembrance is not only remembering those who gave the supreme sacrifice, and there were thousands of people who did, which is something that we must do and continue to do. It is also remembering what it means to be human in a beautiful but often chaotic and sometimes dangerous world, and to recommit ourselves to the values these brave women and men were so selflessly trying to uphold. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation to bring greetings on behalf of the university president. And thank you to those who are going to be telling us stories, and we look forward to hearing them. Thank you very much.
The UNB Remembers ceremony has changed a little bit from year to year as we've sort of grown and learned from what we've done in past years. But one thing that's always remained the same, and to me is the most special part of our ceremony, are the stories we tell of the members of our UNB community who left this place, this very place, to go to Europe. And so this year we have biographies, as in the past, of a soldier killed during the First World War and one from the Second World War. This year we also have a really special piece to add to the biography of our First World War soldier. We have some letters home that he sent and were published in newspapers at the time. And so I'm going to call on Rebecca Carls to come and read the first letter from Frank Tingley, followed by Mark Simons, who's an honors student in history, who will give us tell us a little bit about Frank and who he was and what he did. And finally, Amanda Short, who's a Bachelor of Science Kinesiology honors student, who will share one more letter. So thanks so much, folks.
Lieutenant Tingley is recovering. Received by friends in St. John. St. John, New Brunswick, June 10. Several letters have been received in the city from Lieutenant F.H. Tingley of Moncton. Writing from France on Sunday, May 9, he said, "Have not been able to write for some time. I was hit on Monday, May 3, with shrapnel and got a good dose of it. 8 pieces in my left knee, but only 2 of them remained in and were taken out in this hospital. 1 large piece went through my left hand and 1 through my right arm. When the doctors saw my knee, they told me it would be stiff permanently, as the kneecap is broken and a piece of shrapnel lodged in the fracture. But it has been making such good progress that this morning they said I would probably recover the full use of my knee. I'm glad, if only for skating. Have had both my knee and hand x-rayed. My wounds have healed so fast that the matron told me this morning I'm booked for tomorrow's hospital ship for England, in all probability for London. They won't give me any idea as to when I will be fit again, but they say that I will not see France again for 3 or 4 months anyway. Suppose you have heard from the papers of the fighting around Ypres and the Yser River? That is where I got mine and where all the Canadian casualties were. I can now understand why this is called La Belle and sunny France, as the weather is perfect. I've been in 4 dressing stations and 3 hospitals since I was hit before I arrived here, all in 2 days on my way back from the line. Must stop now, as it is time to eat. Arrived here on Tuesday, May 10. My hurts are getting along nicely, with the exception of my knee, which has proven by x-ray both at Boulogne and London to have a broken kneecap. It is still in splints and will be for probably 3 more weeks. My right arm is healing very fast and will be all cured in a couple of weeks, but my left hand will take a month. Think I had better write to old von Hindenburg and get him to court-martial that gun crew, because they missed my right leg altogether. My doctor says it must have been an oversight. There are lots of callers to see me every day, mostly Canadians in London, Mr. George McLaren Brown, European representative of the CP Royal, Mr. Ernest H. Turnbull, representing in Mr. F. W. Sumner's absence, the province of New Brunswick, and others. Fred Corbett, Mr. Sumner's chauffeur, comes every day with his big 7-passenger Pierce Arrow, and as Mr. Sumner is still in Moncton, Corbett has nothing to do but drive around London. The doctors say I may go out with him next week. Before the battle, they say that it was hardly safe to admit you were a Canadian around London on account of the devilry they kicked up while on the planes. But now the Canadians own this little hamlet. They are certainly using us great. As already mentioned, I was hit on May 3rd and have had a splint on my leg since May 5th. It's the most tiresome thing I've ever had to put up with, and the doctor says it will be 2 or 3 weeks still before it comes off. The splint, not my leg. P.S. I'm writing this in bed, so it's not as good as usual.
Captain Frank Harvey Tingley was born in the winter of 1890 in the village of Point de Butte near the New Brunswick-Nova Scotia border. He received his general education in Moncton before leaving home to attend the University of New Brunswick in 1906. While here in Fredericton, Tingley studied civil engineering, graduating with the class of 1910. When war broke out in 1914, Tingley was already serving in the 19th Battery Canadian Field Artillery out of Moncton. Tingley had 2.5 years prior service with the militia at the war's outset, holding the rank of lieutenant. The military and command experience, combined with his technical training and work experience as a civil engineer, would have made Tingley an ideal candidate for full-time service as an artillery officer in France. It was experienced militiamen like Tingley who, along with the veterans of the South African War, would form the backbone of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the early days of the war. Tingley, now with the 8th Battery, fought at the Second Battle of Ypres in the spring of 1915. While acting as a forward observational officer, Tingley and his signaller, Joseph Como, were hit by a German shell on May 3rd. He would later recount, quote, "It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that we were struck. A shell burst through the top of the house, demolishing the roof and carrying away a portion of the front of the house," unquote. Tingley was severely wounded, as we just heard, but survived. Sadly, signaller Como was not so lucky. The wounds that Tingley received were serious enough to warrant a return to Canada for his recovery, and his actions that day would earn him the Military Cross. He would remain in Canada until the early spring of 1916, in which he would return to his battery in France. A few short months later, he would be injured a second time, this instance a gunshot wound to the leg, once again earning him convalescence in Canada. Promoted to the rank of captain for his notable service, Tingley refused a long-term position in Canada, remaining only until properly healed and returning to the front once again in late 1916. The years of war and repeated injuries were catching up to Tingley at this point, however, and he reported to an aid station with neurasthenia, commonly referred to at the time as shell shock. It is a testament to his dedication that he would once again return to his men at the front in early 1917, after spending several months recovering behind the lines. Now with the 23rd Battery, Tingley would remain with them until the end of his war. Sadly, he would not see the world return to peace. Hit by an aircraft bomb in early September of 1918, Tingley sustained severe wounds, succumbing to them on the 14th of October 1918, less than a month before the war's end. He's buried today at a British cemetery in Pas-de-Calais, France. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this ceremony. Lieutenant Tingley's wound, inflicted by machine gun. He was wounded near the same place as formerly, lies in the same hospital, is attended by the same doctor, and wrote to the same man just before he was hit. String of strange coincidences. Particulars of the second wounding of Lieutenant Frank H. Tingley, MC, have just reached Moncton, in letters to his father, Major A.J. Tingley, in some Moncton friends, and reveals some remarkable series of coincidences between the circumstances under which he was wounded in the spring of 1915 and those under which he was injured a couple of weeks ago. In the course of a letter to an old comrade of the 8th Battery, Ting says they, the Germans, got me where I live, and I nearly got my RIP this time, indicating that he is still cheerful in spite of evident seriousness of his injuries. So far as can be gathered from the letters, Lieutenant Tingley was out in no man's land between the British and German trenches looking for a new location for the forward observing station of his battery. In the darkness, he went up too close to the German lines, with the result that Fritz caught sight of him and opened fire with a machine gun. Mr. Tingley bolted back the way he came, but had only run a dozen steps when he was hit by a bullet in the leg. The ball entered the front of the thigh, grazed the bone, and passed out behind. The officer fell in a heap, but remained perfectly conscious and was able, by rolling over and over, to make it back to the trench in safety. Here's where a series of coincidences commence. The place where he was shot is located only a short distance from the trench where he was hit last year. The wound is again in the leg. He was in the same hospital to which he was taken last year and is attended by the same doctor. In the letter received by Mr. Charlie Lee yesterday, but written before he was wounded the second time, Lieutenant Tingley reminds Mr. Lee that he, Lee, was the last person to whom he wrote last year, just before he was wounded, and jestingly wondered if history would repeat itself. It has done so all right. Can you beat it? In the letters received here today, Mr. Tingley states that his wound is not a dangerous one and that he is coming around all right. It is expected that he will return to Canada as soon as he is able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, Mark, and Amanda. Now to bring us a biography of Arthur McClenahan from the class of 1942 is Caitlin Steva, an MA history student.
Flight Sergeant Arthur Cedric McClenahan was born on 14 September 1918. A native of Fredericton, Arthur graduated from Fredericton High School in 1937 and became the fifth McClenahan brother to attend UNB. Arthur enrolled in the forestry program in the fall of 1938, and his time at the school was busy. Not only did he balance his academics with his love and involvement in varsity sports, but he also enlisted in the UNB contingent of the Canadian Officers Training Corps, where he served as a private for 2 years. During his summers off from school, Arthur remained active, participating in several recreational sports leagues and working for the provincial government at the Department of Lands and Mines. After completing only 2 years of his program here, Arthur left UNB to enlist with the Royal Canadian Air Force in May 1941. Serving initially in the rank of aircraftman, Arthur would spend the next 18 months in Canada undergoing training, during which time he was promoted to leading aircraftman. In October 1942, having successfully completed his flight training, Arthur was awarded his pilot's license and promoted to the rank of flight sergeant. Then, in January 1943, Arthur left Canada, bound for the United Kingdom, where he would spend several more months undergoing training at various Royal Air Force bases. In August 1943, Arthur was transferred to the 424 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, a medium bomber squadron, then serving in the Mediterranean theater. He left for North Africa on 12 August, arriving with his unit several days later at the Zena airfield in northern Tunisia. The 424 Squadron was tasked with flying strategic bombing missions over southern Italy in support of the upcoming invasion of Italy, Operation Avalanche, that was set to begin on 3 September. During one of his nightly missions, it was at that point that Arthur and his crew went MIA. On 26 August 1943, only 2 weeks after arriving in theater, Flight Sergeant Arthur McClenahan was presumed dead, killed in action over Taranto, Italy. For his service, Flight Sergeant McClenahan was awarded the 1939-45 Star, the Italy Star, the Defense Medal, the War Medal, the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal and Clasp. Additionally, in 1946, in recognition of his sacrifice, Arthur was posthumously awarded his operational wings. Today, Flight Sergeant McClenahan lies buried in the Bari War Cemetery in southern Italy, alongside 2,000 others who lost their lives during the First and Second World War. Arthur McClanahan died a world away from where he grew up and from where we sit today here in Fredericton. And sometimes that distance can make commemoration and remembrance difficult. And yet he was a student on this campus. He walked through the same pathways and some of the same buildings that we walk through every day. And as we remember here today, and we prepare to do so again on 11 November, it's about those things that connect us to the past. And by focusing on those things, the memory of Arthur McClanahan and Frank Tingley and all the other victims of these conflicts will remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Often when we attend Remembrance Day ceremonies, we hear about the brave men who left our campuses or left our communities to fight. And it's important, I think, in a university to think about the bigger picture and to think about all those who've been touched by war in various ways. And so we're very happy to have Melinda Jarrett, the director of the Fredericton Region Museum today, to share with us a little bit of her research and understanding about war brides and their experience in conflict.
I recognize and respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional lands of the Wolastoqey, who have lived here for time immemorial. You know, we say that now in 2018 to acknowledge the First Nations of Wabanaki territory, but it wasn't always so. I'm sure that when a young English war bride named Jean Paul arrived in Canada in May 1946, nobody said those words to her, and they probably never said them to her husband, Charlie Paul, either. Charlie Paul was from Tobic First Nation. Then it was called the Tobic Indian Reserve. When the Second World War broke out, Charlie and his brother Jim joined the Carleton York Regiment, and they found themselves stationed overseas in England, training for the ground war that everyone knew was just a breath away. Charlie and Jean Keegan met in Coldson, Surrey in 1942, when she was just 15 years old. They were married the next year when she was 16. One would think that the marriage of an English woman and a statist Indian from Canada would have raised a few eyebrows in Coldson. But according to the Keegan family, there was never a hint of racism towards Charlie in England. And if there was, the Keegans didn't notice. In fact, it wasn't until Charlie's and Jean's first child, a daughter, was born in 1944 that the idea of Charlie being any different from the other Canadian soldiers even came up in conversation. Jean's older sister, Pat, told me about a time when a friend came to the house to see Jean's baby, and she said, "Oh, she's white." Pat said she was astonished by the comment because they'd never thought of Charlie or his brother Jim as not being like us, she said. In Britain, however, the Red Cross tried to dissuade 16-year-old Jean Keegan from marrying a native Canadian, and so did the padre of Charlie's regiment, the Carleton York. But Jean wouldn't hear of it. After the war, the men were repatriated to Canada, and when shipping opened up for civilian traffic, the war brides were next. By the time it was all over, nearly 44,000 war brides were transported to Canada on the war bride ships like the Queen Mary with their 22,000 children, most of them babies. New Brunswick had its fair share, 1,800 war brides and 900 children after the war. First stop was Pier 21 in Halifax, then to Macadam, or then by train to Moncton or St. John, and then upriver to Macadam. When Jean arrived at Macadam train station in May 1946, she was met by Val Rhea Hunter, a long-time volunteer with the Red Cross whose job it was to meet war brides at the point of disembarkation. Val Rhea made sure these women and children were safely handed off either to the husband or to relatives who would then head to their ultimate destination. Now, Val Rhea was a force to be reckoned with, and she was known to question the identity of these men who were picking up war brides at the station. One young war bride, Brenda MacArthur, was forced to spend the night in the hotel at the station until the identity of her husband could be proven the next day. Welcome to Canada. But in Val Rhea's diary, there is an entry for Jean Paul. Met at station by R.C., and I'm assuming that means the Roman Catholic priest, and taken upriver to Tobique. Family lore is that Jean was taken in a canoe upriver to the reserve. Imagine what that must have felt like for a big city girl from England. 17 years old now. People in the surrounding community certainly noticed the presence of a young English war bride on the reservation. In the January 1947 minutes of the Perth Andover Red Cross Society, the Welfare Committee reported that it provided a layette of 41 pieces ready to go to an English war bride who married a Maliseet Indian. Jean was the only white woman on the reserve, and conditions were rough. Their second daughter, Cindy, recalls that the Indian agent making his annual assessments and dropping off a barrel of flour, and he would leave army rations, including hardtack, for the family. At the Catholic convent school, the nuns gave cod liver oil to fight off malnutrition and rickets. Life wasn't easy for Jean and Charlie, but they managed. She never complained to her family back in England, who knew nothing about the challenges she faced in Tobique until many years later when her mother came to visit. You can just imagine what she must have thought. Jean adapted to a dramatically different way of life on the reserve, and she learned how to speak the Maliseet language fluently. The family picked blueberries in the summer and potatoes in the fall. They fished and hunted, and Charlie worked as a guide in the season. Charlie was good to her, and although the first few years were marked by poverty and struggle, they eventually did very well for themselves. Charlie became involved with the Union of New Brunswick Indians, and they moved to Fredericton in the 1970s, where Jean really came into her own after 30 years on the reserve. They raised 6 children, all of whom have been successful in their own right. Jean died in 2004, but her memory lives on. In 2000, that year, her grandson, T.J. Burke, became the first Native member of the New Brunswick legislature and later Minister of Justice and Corporate Affairs. In December 2005, Burke introduced a motion in the New Brunswick legislature to officially recognize 2006 as the Year of the War Bride, sparking a grassroots movement that spread across the country until nearly every province in Canada did the same. And to think it all started with an English war bride named Jean Keegan, who fell in love with a First Nations man named Charlie Paul from Tobique. Today, we remember them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda. I can't help but think about how different New Brunswick is because of those 1,800 women and their children and their grandchildren, some of whom have come to UNB, have been part of our community. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. The next part of our ceremony is perhaps the more traditional Remembrance Day part of our ceremony, and I'm really pleased to invite Dr. Alan Sears to lead us in the act of remembrance.
I was fascinated to hear all of the coincidences in Frank Tingley's experience in France. And I have another coincidence for you because Jean and Charlie Paul were next door neighbors to my family and I for 10 years after they moved to Fredericton. So we got to experience them and remember them today as well. I'm going to ask you to stand with me for the act of remembrance, please. Most of you are familiar. I learned today that the act of remembrance actually has 2 verses. We're all familiar, I think, with the first. So I'm going to say the first and end with, of course, the line, "We will remember them," and you echo that line back to me. Then we'll stay standing for the last post, 2 minutes of silence and reveille. And then I will say the second verse of the act of remembrance, which has the same prompt and response at the end. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. they were young, as we are young, they served, giving freely of themselves. To them we pledge amid the winds of time to carry their torch and never forget. We will remember them. We will remember them.
The next part of our ceremony is the laying of the wreaths. First, we have Dr. Lee Windsor, Deputy Director of the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, laying a wreath on behalf of the Gregg Center. On behalf of the UNB Art Center, laid by Director Marie Maltais, a wreath dedicated to the memory of Lieutenant George Paget Owen Fenwick, who graduated with his BA from UNB in 1902 and was killed at Passchendaele on October 30th, 1917. Lieutenant Fenwick is also honored by the window to my right that Marie and her team have so successfully led a restoration campaign for. It's really nice to know that Lieutenant Fenwick is remembered at our institution forever. By Francine Jutras, a wreath laid on behalf of the College of Extended Learning in honor of veterans and military families. A wreath laid by Emily Reed and Melanie Kibsey from the Faculty of Nursing on behalf of and in memory of nursing sisters and their contribution to war. A wreath being laid by Laura Balakrishnan on behalf of the staff of the Advancement Office at UNB. A wreath being laid by Nicola Cassidy and Jessica Hatt-Gooding on behalf of and in remembrance of UNB employees from the UNB Human Resources Office. A wreath on behalf of the Professional and Technical Staff Union, Local 60551, being laid by PTSU member Bev Bramble in memory of all who have served. A wreath being laid by Dr. Paul Howe on behalf of Renaissance College students, staff, and faculty. A wreath from Unifor Local 4504 being laid by Oliver Flecknell. And finally, a wreath being laid by Natasha Ashfield on behalf of the UNB Communications Office in memory of all those who fought. Thank you so much. We're almost at the end of our ceremony, but it's time for my favorite part. And I'm really thrilled to introduce one of my favorite people at UNB, Wilfred Langmaid, to come and lead us in a reflection.
My reputation for verbosity has preceded me by the fact that you have been seated, but my comments will be brief today. There has been so much of great significance that's taken place over a very few minutes here that there's not really a lot for me to add. As we leave this assembly, as we leave this celebration, as we leave this tribute, let's continue to give thanks for the bravery and the service of our military personnel in the past and today. And as one here not involved in the active organization of the event, let's give thanks for the ready willingness of organizers and attenders to remember today. Indeed, from humble beginnings, this has become a really important part of the UNB fabric, and the cautious optimism that marks my life, this room is going to be filled one of these years. But numbers have been creeping up over the years, and that is very gratifying. While most of us are seated right now, we have stood for the truth today, deeply aware of the cost of war. As many of you know, my association with the military, and indeed with Remembrance Day, stems from my childhood in Charlotte County. The uncle I never knew, Donald Maxwell, was killed in action in Holland in 1944. I heard very similar stories with Mr. Paul. I would imagine that they would have encountered one another in the Carleton and York Regiment, in fact. And Uncle Donald was part of the operation involved in the liberation of Belgium, which occurred, but after his death, and he was laid to rest in Bergen-op-Zoom Cemetery in the Netherlands. And my memories of Remembrance Day are just so very vivid because I was brought up with my grandmother. An only child, my mom and dad, and my grandmother lived with us, and she was the only living Silver Cross mother of the community, and I loved her dearly, and always went with her every year. And it was the one day a year that her stoicism, her courage, and her faith, they were still there, but they were shaken, and she always would wonder why dear Donald had to die. But then she knew before she even answered the question, it was for the cost of freedom. It was for the life that we were enjoying then in the 1960s in St. George, and that we are enjoying today here in Fredericton, in this land of liberty and freedom and shared values. Uncle Donald and all who served with him, their deepest hope was to be of service to their people. I would simply pray that as we leave this place, we would be enabled to carry forth that example. It was so wonderful to hear Dr. Sears read, and it had been years since I'd heard it, the second part. Because indeed we do need to carry the torch and never forget. And indeed we do make that pledge amid the winds of time. May we always, always remember.
Thank you so much, Wilfred. People ask me every year, Sarah, why are you doing this? What is this? Why are you doing this Remembrance Day ceremony? You're not a historian. You don't seem to, this isn't your research field. And my connection to Remembrance Day is very much like Wilfred's. I had a great uncle I never met. John Percy Teamy was killed on D-Day, my grandmother's brother. He was 21. My grandma tells the story of being 11 years old and being pulled out of school in Holden, Alberta, to hear that Uncle Jackie wasn't coming home. And when I went on the Greg Center Teachers Tour, I had the absolute great privilege to introduce my peers, my friends then, to Uncle Jackie, and we visited him at Benny-sur-Mer Cemetery. And last week, my grandmother went and visited her brother for the first time. And so my connection to Remembrance Day is to remember men like Uncle Jackie who didn't get to go to university, who were farm boys, who the biggest body of water they saw before they put him across the English Channel was his bathtub. And so those stories shape who I am and my connection, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share that with my UNB family. And so just before we finish up, I have so many thank yous to offer to Mike Johnston and the folks here in Memorial Hall who set the space for us each year so willingly, to the Greg Center for their support, to the UNB History Society, and particularly to Mark Simons, who really took the lead this year on finding volunteers and creating those beautiful biographies that we heard. To all our speakers and those of you who volunteered to lay wreaths today, to our musicians, to Matthew Baxter, our bugler, and to Peter McDougall, our VP of HR, who is also a very talented piper. I don't know if anyone else is a musician, but I am always astounded by the last post when I realize you don't use the valves. You just have to use your mouth to make all that beautiful music, so thank you so much. I also want to thank Kate Charette and Trip Lewis, but neither of whom are here today, but without whom this would not exist, and have been my partners in crime for the past 6 years in developing this ceremony. To the UNB Arts Center, and particularly to Marie Malte for every year setting the lobby of the Memorial Hall for us in a space that helps us to remember. To marketing, particularly to Amy Weiches, and to the UNB Media Services and the President's Office for facilitating the live stream today. To the Royal Canadian Legion and to Anne Pugh for selling poppies and helping us all to have that visual reminder of remembrance. And of course, thank you so much to all of you for attending. I share Wilfred's hope that one day we'll have to open that balcony because there will be so many people in this space, but I do know that lots of you are watching on the live stream, but it's really gratifying to see you all here today. So thank you so much for taking time out of your rainy, awful Friday to spend with us in remembrance. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.